force the bacteria to make chemicals that nature doesn't want them to make, bioengineering can amplify their natural capacity to make glutamic acid. All we need is a good understanding of genetics and metabolic pathways, some clever technology, and we have a healthy, tireless and tailor-made workforce churning out natural products with a speed and selectivity that the human organic chemist simply can't match.
Turning sunlight into cheap electricity has been a dream for decades. At 9:45 this morning, plugging into the sun meets a Swiss chemist who may be close to achieving that dream. And if you've just joined us, you're watching the Open University on BBC2. In 25 minutes, the series on culture and belief in Europe explores the Spanish palace of El Escorial. That's after the course on running the country takes a look at the changes in the National Health Service following the introduction of an internal market.
For more than 40 years, NHS hospitals were run with a curious division of responsibilities. On the one hand, there was a hierarchy of administrators and managers who were responsible for budgets. On the other hand, there was a separate hierarchy of doctors who were responsible for the clinical activities that actually spent the money. In 1986, central government launched the Resource Management Initiative, an attempt to bring the two hierarchies closer together. We're going to examine the ups and downs of this struggle to get money and medicine to talk to each other. Resource management essentially provides workload-related budgets for doctors or groups of doctors. The initiative was piloted at 6 hospital sites, but even before the results could be assessed, the climate had changed. Co-author of an independent assessment of those 6 sites is Tim Packwood of Brunel University.
As far as the government was concerned, it was set up as a 3-year experiment. But then, of course, with the NHS review in 1989, and before the experiment had been fully evaluated, the government announced that as far as they were concerned, it was a good thing for the National Health Service. It was to cease being experimental, and it was to be rolled out across the service, and that has happened. So the government do seem to have made up their particular minds about it.
We're going to see how resource management, RM for short, has developed at 2 of the pilot sites, and in particular at what institutional changes are taking place. What has been the main objectives of those who wish to introduce resource management?
From the government's point of view, there was a hope that resource management would enable a more efficient and effective management of clinical activities than had been possible in the past. I think local managers, too, in hospitals hoped that it would enable them to really understand and be able to get a grip on some of the clinical activities that were being provided for patients. Doctors, I think, felt that it might enable them to give a better quality service to their patients, because they would actually have far more information about what their patients needed and the implications of treatment, and that they would be able to direct resources more effectively to where they were needed. So it appealed in rather different ways to a number of different audiences.
The Royal Infirmary in Huddersfield is a general hospital with 525 beds and a budget of over £30 million. Lack of information on how well resources are being used by various hospital groups and activities was seen as a major rationale for RM.
Huddersfield was already committed to providing better information to doctors to help them manage their workload. We'd already started as a second-generation management budgeting site to provide them with information with a view to them managing what they were doing better. But they were clearly interested in statistical information rather more than budgetary information, and not at a macro level. They wanted to look at it at individual patient level. So we were already committed to providing them with good clinical information. And resource management helped us. It was a catalyst for us to get in there a bit faster and move a bit quicker down a road we were probably going to go anyway.
Our second pilot site is the Freeman Hospital in Newcastle. It's a teaching hospital with 805 beds and a budget of £56 million. Giving the background to the introduction of RM is consultant surgeon Peter Wright.
This hospital is rather different from many hospitals in that it's relatively new. And when it opened, many of the consultant appointments were new appointments, so you were not left with an inbuilt hierarchy. And an ethos developed of there being a first among equals, of consultants being elected among themselves to run the various units within the hospital. So in effect, we didn't start off at a disadvantage with an inbuilt hierarchy that had to be got around. The change really came about the early 1980s when the financial circumstances changed. It became a much more explicitly cash-limited service. And it was at this time when the amount of resource in terms of cash came to be much more restricted that questions began to be asked by the clinicians about why.
So, under cash limits, doctors were forced to become more interested in both clinical and financial information. How did management at the Freeman view RM? What were their objectives? Chief Executive Len Fenwick.
Primarily to try and make better use of the resources available to us. At times we really weren't aware of quality of care, where the costs were going, and how things were being done. And it was really a methodology to try and improve the situation. We primarily concentrated upon two areas: information technology. The National Health Service did need to take a quantum leap forward, and we also concentrated upon organisational development, looking at the behaviour, the power base of the organisation, culture, the activity of the key players in the organisation.
But many doctors were not sure that they could or should manage, so they had to be convinced.
And the resource management exercise was basically an exercise to refine the management budgeting information and add to it clinical data in the form we now call case mix. And case mix is really the how manys, the what sort of patients are you dealing with, what is wrong with them, how many things are wrong, and what do you do about this. We then ended up with a very powerful database. And the important thing about that database was that it was provided by the clinicians. The clinician had a sense of ownership. It was their data. So not only was it useful for financial and hospital management, it was also data that was potentially useful for the audit and for the clinician's own professional purposes. And this was a major step forward because it allowed the information to be used by all parties. So you had a common currency and everybody was talking about the same information, which made a major breakthrough when dealing with the various relationships within and without the hospital.
Before it was 3 years old, the Resource Management Initiative was overtaken by a much bigger change. The 1989 White Paper announced the introduction of an internal or provider market throughout the NHS. So now the involvement of doctors in resource management was to be set within an environment where hospitals had to compete for patients.
It's the fact that we're now working in the purchaser-provider relationship in a world of contracts. And it really doesn't matter whether we're a trust hospital or a directly managed hospital. The information that we need to fulfill these contracts is now much more detailed. And I think the information systems that have been set up are a major bonus and allow us to work very effectively in this particular field. But it does emphasize the fact that all hospitals are going to have to work along this way if they're effectively going to be able to deliver the information necessary to provide the quality of clinical care that is necessary and will be demanded by the purchasers in the future.
Given these external pressures, how has the internal structure of the hospital changed? One common response has been the development of clinical directorships, where one person takes responsibility for all the different types of staff working in a particular service.
The idea of a clinical directorship is that you begin to focus your activities on your outputs. You divide up your hospital at the sub-unit level according to the services that you're giving to patients. So instead of your hospital being organised on the basis of a nursing hierarchy and a medical system of representatives and paramedical hierarchies, you divide it up on the basis of, say, surgical services or general medical services or some of the supporting services such as radiology or pathology.
Hi, sir. How are you? Dr. Walker, you remember me?
One of the clinical directors at the Royal Infirmary is consultant geriatrician David Walker.
In the past, the management structure has had advice from clinicians. The clinical management structure is a management structure which is, the principle is it has clinicians at the centre. They will be responsible for making the decisions and understanding the consequence of those decisions. Now that's an enormous change from what it used to be like, and requires an enormous change in behaviour and an enormous commitment in terms of time and energy. You're not on any medication which puts you off your food, and I'm a consultant geriatrician. I'm spending something like 2/3 of my time on ward rounds, clinics, day hospitals, seeing patients, albeit that some weeks it's less than that. A third of my time is then spent in some way in management, either managing the resources or learning to manage the resources would be more appropriate in the medical side of the hospital. In addition to that, in connection with management, I'm also trying to enable consultants to learn some of the techniques that I've been fortunate in learning, enable them to get into appraisal systems, understanding budgets along with the finance people, improving in their interpersonal skills, and also to facilitate management development in a wider sense, not just for consultants but also for multidisciplinary groups of staff.
So clinical directorships mean more management responsibility for doctors. They also represent a move from separate nurse and doctor hierarchies to a service-by-service focus.
This hospital is broken down into about 16 such portions. They're known as specialties or subspecialties, and we manage them accordingly with a clinical head of department. In some parts of the country they're called clinical directors. We call them clinical heads of department, and they're supported by a specialty manager, and the majority of them are nursing staff, so they wear both the nurse professional hat and the business management hat.
50.
The resources are allocated to the specialties, and within a given sum they're able to hire and fire and distribute their resources accordingly to meet the needs of the organisation. Of course, again, much is well defined now by contract, but they're certainly able to flex their budgets, they're able to change their staffing profile, they're able to purchase items, change stocks, and so forth. There's clearly a much greater interface between, for example, doctors and nurses in terms of, say, the ward organisation, planning the caseload, organising the resources around the patients to ensure that the best effective use is made of the ward space, theatre time, the skills available.
As well as being a consultant at the Freeman, Peter Wright is also clinical head of department for general surgery.
Now, the thing that is different between the way we have to manage ourselves compared with an outside company is that where in an outside company, if somebody doesn't perform according to the agreed criteria, he might find career opportunities elsewhere. This is a little difficult in the health service because everybody has a particular speciality, and it is very difficult to actually maintain that same sort of relationship. And the managerial relationship is much more a first among equals than a rigid directorship. In fact, some people have said that in hospitals where they've had a very rigid clinical directorate, the clinical directorates which can have been said to have failed are those where the director thought he was a director.
How are differences of interest or perspective being negotiated or resolved?
Doctors, nurses tend to react to patients as they present themselves to them as individuals, whereas general management has got to think more in terms of overall numbers and annual budgets. But I think as resource management has gone on, there has inevitably been some convergence. That given that the service providers are having to manage more of their own resources, inevitably they have to think more beyond the interests of the particular individual. They have to think in terms of what their annual caseload is, what the annual mix of activities in their work is, and whether it could be more effectively put together. And general managers, for their part, if they are getting the service providers to do this kind of thing, they don't really need to do it for them any longer, or they shouldn't need to do it for them any longer.
I know you've been in Voltaro for a while. That may be the cause of ulcers. It says
I think initially there were some thoughts that this was all about Big Brother, the general manager coming along, endeavouring to capture activity and drive the organisation forward in a very draconian fashion. I think time has shown that clearly that's not the case. It is all about teamwork. And of course what is now driving the service forward is the contracting process. And that's very much now the nub of our resource management activities. We're able to demonstrate what we would call case mix, the range and type of patients that are treated in the hospital, where they come from, how long they stay, how well they've done in hospital, what the costs of the case are, and we're of course using that in terms of both quality of service and managing the contracts in the post-NHS reformed world.
Resource management and clinical directorships may produce better teamwork, but in the internal market, the hospital has to adjust its services to fit the contracts it can win from purchasers.
Can I lie you back in? Are you a new man?
Ian Griffiths is a consultant rheumatologist at the Freeman. He also has a management role as medical director on the hospital board.
Are you stiff at all?
The degree of enthusiasm for the resource management initiative has varied from one discipline to another, and for really quite valid reasons. For example, if you're dealing with a specialty like elective orthopedics, where you have long waiting lists, you can control your admissions, then things like resource management becoming very relevant. You can choose what sort of case mix you put through your ward, how you match it up with your theatre facilities, your nursing facilities. If you're dealing with an acute medical specialty, like say acute general medicine, where 80%, 90% of your admissions to the ward are going to be acute medical admissions, it's of less value, because at the end of the day, the decision as to whether you bring a patient in or not will depend on, firstly, is there a patient in casualty that needs to come into hospital, or is there a general practitioner on the end of the phone saying, you know, please admit this patient? And secondly, do you have a bed? And those are the two major factors that are going to influence whether you do or don't bring a patient into hospital. And in that situation, all the information about sort of, you know, what's wrong with the patient in terms of diagnosis, what procedures you do in the patients, what the costs are, become of very secondary importance to that overriding need to get a patient into a hospital if there's a bed available.
Tightening up on hospital costs may have consequences for other parts of the healthcare system. Richard Sainsbury is a consultant surgeon at the Royal Infirmary.
Traffic wasn't too bad?
No, I came on the train.
You came on the train?
He describes himself as one of the second wave of doctors that were introduced to RM.
I hope we're working towards a common aim of achieving a more efficient service. Within that, though, there are definite vested interest groups. We're interested in seeing our beds full, in getting our patients through in the minimum time, and therefore as cheaply as possible. Cost isn't everything to us as clinicians. It may be more efficient to keep someone in hospital an extra night, for instance, if they don't then need home nurses, district nurses, and the GP to go out 3 times the following day. This is something we can't quantify at the moment with resource management or with any system, but hopefully that will come.
With more detailed and reliable information, managers can now both support and challenge doctors in the planning of facilities.
The latest issue that we're talking about is the utilisation of beds in obstetrics, gynaecology and paediatrics. Looking over the past year, the occupancies in those specialties have been lower than we would expect.
If we were to have a choice as to which facility here, of course we would prefer to be within the family of general medicine. As John has
We
said,
sat down with the consultants, pulled together where the occupancy is lower than it ought to be, and said, what can we do about it? And the result of that is a ward closing on our side of the house, which has now been offered to medicine for the elderly, and it will be a ward of more acute patients being transferred from St Luke's.
in terms of the geriatric ward, it would never have happened in the past because of the traditional lines of power that have been drawn over the years since 1948. But since the objective information has come into the scene, there's no doubt that that is very, very powerful, and has led to a change which we wouldn't have seen 5 or 10 years ago.
Implementing resource management itself has meant extra costs, in both time and money. Has this expenditure been worth it? Could the money have been better spent elsewhere?
I suppose that's true whatever you spend money on in the health service. There are finite resources in the health service and infinite demand. Doesn't matter how much money we put into the health service, you can always spend more. And so yes, it's true to say that we could have spent it on something else. But I would argue that we've generated benefits that we might not have done had we not spent the money on better information systems. And that any organisation that spends, as this hospital does, 28 million per annum, needs that sort of information system to enable it to be managed effectively. So yes, we could have spent it on the CAT scanner, we could have spent it on many things, but we wouldn't have generated benefits like we have without the information systems that we've got. Things like better use of the beds that we talked about earlier. We wouldn't have done that without better information systems. There are all sorts of examples where perhaps not savings, but we've contained costs.
Resource management makes the cost structure more transparent, so it points out possible savings.
It's like an orangey.
Some can be achieved just through better organisation, but others strike deeper by raising questions of staffing levels and what services are to be provided at all.
This is one of the interesting aspects that sort of causes quite a bit of concern. We had a look at it in our own discipline in terms of looking at what was controllable by a clinician in terms of outpatient costs and inpatient costs. And by controllable, what I was thinking about was things like the drugs I prescribed, the investigations I ordered. And the interesting aspect that emerged was the relatively small percentage of the costs that were controllable. It was something in the region of about 15% for an inpatient admission and something like 25% for an outpatient admission. And the vast bulk of costs that we were incurring were things like salaries for medical staff, nursing staff, overhead charges for the hospital, which at this moment in time I don't perceive as being controllable.
The main success of the resource management experiment has been the application of the new process of management, getting the service providers, the doctors and nurses, involved in actually managing their own activities, not just deciding what activities they want to carry out, but actually managing the activities, managing the resources that are involved, and getting involved in the planning and the prioritising of their work at a larger level, thinking beyond the individual.
The Resource Management Initiative started out as an attempt to bring some of the different tribes within the NHS, managers, doctors and nurses, to work more closely together. We've heard the broadly positive testimony of key players at 2 pilot sites, places where money and information technology have been pumped in to encourage better resource management. But now the systems are being rapidly rolled out to hundreds of hospitals, some of them much less well prepared. For RM, or something like it, has become almost essential in the new world of competition and contracts. Not just efficiency, but institutional survival may be at stake.
The 1988 Education Act marked a turning point for the way schools are funded, giving them the flexibility to decide whether to remain under local education authority control or to opt out and go grant-maintained. Schools have responded in different ways, with implications as far-reaching as the way the day-to-day maintenance of school buildings is carried out, to the organisation and provision of school meals. Partnership or going it alone? This morning at 11.
And now Tim Benton explores the monastery and palace of El Escorial to see what it reveals about the mind of its builder, King Philip II of Spain.
All the marvels which have ever been celebrated down the ages are brought here together, stripped of superfluity, mere vainglory or ambition. For he who sees and understands the building, it will be as if he were reading a book of God's wondrous works. Perpetual disorder and disharmony rule among endless ambition and scheming. The monks who profess celibacy are like tomcats